Hello, this is Angelia, and you are listening to or watching the podcast, Why You Do What You Do. The podcast that talks about human development and psychology to maybe help you figure out a little bit more about why you do what you do. I think my microphone has given up the ghost here, so I'm going to turn up the one on the thing here, and hope I don't sound too much like I'm talking in a barrel, because that's kind of how it sounds sometimes. But anyway, we were talking about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and how the mass madness had spread back in the day. And we're going to start talking about some of the social upheaval that was going on. Europe during this period was in an almost constant state of war. All the little kingdoms were fighting against each other. This little king guy, this little chieftain guy, all these guys were fighting against each other. And between the continual battles, such devastating natural disasters as continent-wide famine and the infamous Black Death swept over the countryside. And I'm sure we've all read in the history books about the Black Death, the plague, where bodies were just being stacked up and carted out of the city and burnt and everything. And so that was, a pretty horrible thing. Excuse me. Killing millions more people. Nevertheless, despite all this social upheaval, by the 15th century, the Renaissance had begun. And of course, we all know the Renaissance guys, like Da Vinci and, the guy, Galileo and everybody, who was trying to further, the knowledge of humans, instead of all the superstitious and angry stuff going on, a movement characterized by a return to greater rationalism, thinking, using your brain, that had begun to spread slowly across the continent. And it's probably because people were resistant to it that it was spreading slowly. It was largely fostered by an economic uprising and a greater sense of social stability. That means people were doing better. They were having more money, so they could afford to not be, clenched and angry and, superstitious. So they were feeling a little more comfortable with taking a breath and using their brains. However, one of its offshoots, the Protestant Reformation, once again plunged the populace into turmoil by challenging the supreme authority of the Roman Pope and seriously questioning the validity of what was still, for most people, the core of their existence, their religion. Anytime you got two religions coming at odds, that's usually not going to be a good outcome there. It was also during the Enlightened time that the concept of predestination and the phenomenon of witchcraft were to arise. Now, in the Bible, it talked about them, but, from that time till up to the Renaissance time, there wasn't really a lot of that going on. So, that could be a coincidence, Predestination. The notion was advanced by John Calvin, a Reformation leader, and it later became fairly well established in Puritan colonial America. The basic idea behind predestination is that the fate of each person is determined by God, and nothing a person does can alter that fate. And a lot of people subscribe to that today. I believe God has an outline, and I believe you can do a whole lot of other stuff, to get wherever, but he basically has a starting point and an ending point. And what you do, you fill in it yourself on the way. So I don't think we got the super duper predestination as much as the old reformists kind of thought we did. I don't think every step is prescribed. I think, like I said, God starts you here and you're going to end up here, but what you do along the way is part of your learning how to do some things. So here in the Earth School. An extension of this is that worldly success is a sign of election into God's community. And there are still people who believe that today. They think if you are a good Christian, God's going to bless you with money and stuff, and that's a sign that you're there, buddy. There are some people nowadays who subscribe to that, you know. You just turn on the TV and find them. Both in this life and in the next. Worldly failure, on the other hand, is a sign of predetermined damnation. There are people who believe that today still. They think if you're not doing well and you're having problems, that's because you're not right and you're going to hell. So, you know. And since demonic possession was still believed to cause abnormal behavior, because that was their big, thing back then. You got evil, you got a demon in you and all that kind of crap. And, a lot of people just didn't know what to call it. This too was included in the second category. That is, a person who exhibited strange behavior was possessed. So, if you're going to go by that rationalization, they would have a field day here and now in this world going on today. Which was clear evidence that the person was damned. So, that was their school of thought. And like I said, if you go by that school of thought nowadays, there's a whole lot of people that are going. This led to an interesting situation. The Calvinists firmly believed in the principle that nothing could interfere with what was predestined. But that didn't stop them from trying. And since they were fighting against overwhelming odds, they used harshly punitive measures to exorcise the devils that were there by God's command. So, again, a little contradiction there. So, our forefathers didn't always think. Although we today can see the paradox in this logic, those who devoutly followed Calvin's precepts apparently did not. And that's, some ignorance there. I don't believe they chose to, but, Witchcraft. Thus far, we have differentiated only between the two types of possession. That which occurs more or less accidentally, you just gotta fall into it, and that which occurs because of some grand design. However, there is a supposedly another form which comes about when a person voluntarily and intentionally signs a compact with the devil. And a lot of young people do this. Preteens, mostly, because they feel powerless in their life. And the other team offers them power, that they can take control of their life, they can be successful or whatever. So a lot of our, preteen folks fall into this trap, and can do this. But Jesus saves, and you can get saved and get right if you realize you've done the wrong thing, and if you got into it because you didn't know God yet, even, and you felt like you were just trying to get some power in your life, over your life, because you were powerless, and probably more than likely bad things were happening to you, is why you sought that power anyway. Such people are called witches, and the boys are called warlocks, or whatever. Again, there's different theories on different things. So this is a recurrent theme in Western literature, involving the notion that Satan actively recruits volunteers and, in return for a variety of personal gains, converts some people to evil. And like I said, usually people believe that the evil's going to give them some type of power or something that they need or want in their life, and that's why they go that route. It's a superstition. Witches were therefore seen as willing accomplices in the devil's never-ending attempt to destroy the social order. And honestly, I don't believe the devil's out to destroy our social order. He likes to start, right in your house. He'd much rather deal with families and, you as an individual. I don't think the social order is really on his agenda. An interesting point about witchcraft is its inherently anti-sexual and especially anti-female character. During this period, sexuality was considered to be a special temptation of the devil and therefore evil. So, there were probably some lustful folks pointing some fingers when, they say when you're pointing a finger, there's 3 pointing back at you. Okay, someone's at the door. Temptation was also a woman's specialty, with Eve as the prototype. So, a little sexism happening in there, so the natural extension of this belief was that women were essentially more wicked and more vulnerable to Satan. So, yeah, again, a little sexism in that belief. And there's actually, I've heard some Christians, males, put forth this idea that they believe this. So, the world is still kind of scary sometimes. Consequently, it was assumed that almost all witches were women, and nearly every woman had to prove she was not a witch. So, and the ways on that was crazy, because most often it involved a post-mortem discovery. So, basically there was no winning on that score. The Inquisition. Witches were plentiful in the Renaissance, and witch hunting was a most popular sport. And that's kind of crude that they put it that way, but it's what it became. Witch hunting was a sport, and people, males mostly, enjoyed it because they might have had some issues of their own. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII announced dismay at the number of these evildoers and instituted an inquisition to root out the problem. So maybe Pope Innocent wasn't so innocent. That's just my opinion. Because the problem was probably not as much as it was, being popularized to be. This endorsement from that church's highest authority was, for many people, practically a license to indict any behavior that was unusual or merely disliked. So, if someone didn't like you, guess what? You're on the list. Often neighbors were accused in revenge for insignificant and even imagined slights. Like I said, you don't like so-and-so, they're a witch, and then they're gone, basically. 2 monks, Heinrich Kramer and Johann Springer, spearheaded the campaign to stamp out evil. They did not work without guidelines. Together, they devised a manual to aid their task, one that could be used by other inquisitors as well, entitled Malleus Maleficarum, the Witch's Hammer. It listed all the signs by which people could recognize witches, and it suggested the proper ways of handling them once they were caught. So here we are. These guys made up this whole book on how you could recognize a witch, because this wasn't laid out in any scripture or anything. This is their deal. Then what you should do with them once you found them, which was not good. So, yikes. It was a very successful work, its popularity spanning the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. So there you are, a little superstitious time in our history, where folks, their best-selling book was how to, find and kill witches. Great. The witch hunting craze was not to finally die down until after the infamous Salem witch trials of 1692. And that's because, as we know from, the writings of the time and things, that a lot of that was girls hating on other people, you know. So that gave people some pause and said, well, maybe this is not something we should be doing. Maybe this is not the most reliable thing ever. And it's kind of funny how, you know, that just stopped. Then, you know, suddenly it was over, you know. And I doubt if, you know, the devil gave up because of the witch trials. So, you know, that says something right there, doesn't it? It is quite probable that during these trials, as during earlier trials in Europe, many individuals who were put to death as witches were actually suffering from some kind of emotional disturbance. And, you know, that other than jealousy and hatefulness, that could be very true. In fact, some mentally afflicted people may have even cooperated with their inquisitors under the mistaken belief that they were indeed witches. Because, you know, some people, especially if they, you know, are schizophrenic or, you know, easily led, they might believe, oh, well, maybe I am. Since that was the only explanation they could find at the time for their own strange actions. Like I say, when you come up in a culture and you're steeped in this, even if it's poo-poo, you're going to believe it. So, you know, unfortunately, there were some people there who probably believed they were, you know, of the devil, and that's why they were behaving the way they were. And that's a shame, because probably a whole lot of people died who, you know, if they lived nowadays, could have been treated for mental illness and been fine. Who knows how many ordinary people were handled in a similar fashion simply because of circumstantial evidence and the mass hysteria that gripped virtually every European community. Now, I've known about some mass hysteria. I've seen some mass hysteria at work, and that can be some scary crap. You know, one person says something, other people believe it, and then soon they're all believing it and working from that point that is a true thing, and there might be no basis in fact for it. So yeah, that mass hysteria is kind of a scary thing that can lead to a lot of bad stuff. In contrast with today's more tolerant view, of course, thank God, the deeply religious convictions of the time had little room for behavioral deviance. So, you know, if you were not in the norm, I got a ear itch. I don't know if I got water in my ear when I wash my hair. What happened here? But it's not cool. So, you know, anyone who was a little eccentric, a little not quite right, even shy people, might have been accused of, you know, being on the wrong side. It is interesting to note that in both Predestination and Witchcraft, the explanation of demonology can be either internal or external. So, you know, they agreed on that. The key is whether or not there is some predisposing factor within the individual that opens that person up to possession. Therefore, predestination is an internal approach, while witchcraft is an external approach. The devil makes advances, and some people eventually yield to them. And now that, I believe, is true. I believe the scripture where it says, and the devil walking about as a roaring lion seeketh whom he may devour. That he's always on the prowl. He's always for looking to whoever he can drag down with him. Because he's not a happy camper, because he knows what's going to happen to him. And so he's trying to take as many people with him as he can. Thus, we can see the issue of personal responsibility for misfortune, again, being raised even in relatively early times. So, you know, again, you have free will. Your behaviors are your choice. And the answer that our society provides today is still not very clear. Because, again, with some mental illnesses, you have compulsive behaviors. Me and my husband went shopping, and we worked at a place that hires, we went to a place that hires mentally ill people to work. And there was a guy there who clearly had Tourette's. He was doing hand movements, and he was holding his mouth shut, because you could tell he was blurting something, and he didn't want people to hear it. He might have been cuss words, I don't know. But he was hired by a company who, you know, hires people to work at a store for this. And so in earlier times, he would probably have been accused of being, possessed or whatever. But now we know there is such a thing as Tourette's, and it affects people, and you can get medication to help. There's no real cure for it, but it can lessen your symptoms. So, opposing forces. Even while witch hunting raged across Europe, a few people were risking their reputations, if not their very lives, by disagreeing with the, mass madness, by opposing the craze. Denouncing demonology, they instead suggested that people who behaved strangely were affected by much less evil influences. And it's probably not a popular thing of the day. People wanted it to be like that. People were angry and they wanted, vengeance on these people. Two of these opponents were Paracelsus and Johann Weyer. Paracelsus, a Swiss physician, asserted that the stars, and especially the moon, influenced behavior. In fact, as noted earlier, the term lunatic is derived from the idea, because there are people who, like the tides, like if they have water in the brain or not enough water in the brain, it can affect, their behavior. So, the idea was that the moon made them crazy, and that's not necessarily true. They might have had problems to begin with, and the moon was exacerbating problems. He argued that afflicted people were not to blame for their behavior, which is not always true, but in some cases, and that they needed special care, which is true, not torture and death, which is definitely true. A switch from demonology to astrology as an explanation for abnormal behavior may seem to be a very modest advance, but it was revolutionary for the period. So, we went from mental illness was a problem of evil to mental illness might be caused by the alignment of the moon and stars. So, a step in a better direction for mentally ill people, but still not quite there yet. Johann Weyer also challenged the existence of witches and demons. However, this German physician was convinced that people who exhibited strange actions were in reality mentally ill. And that is the case a lot of the time. I do believe that evil works in the world and that there can be folks who are, affected by it. But, if someone's got some mental illness, then that's, probably an explanation for 90% of the cases. Like Hippocrates, he based his argument on empirical evidence and advanced specific humane medical treatments for various forms of disturbance that he witnessed. So again, he was starting to treat people, not turn them in for being witches. In 1563, he published The Deception of Demons, which attacked the points made in the Malleus Maleficarum, and declared that demonology was offensive to both God and humanity. So he was taking a more scientific view of things. Weyer's close observation of afflicted people led him to conclude that disturbing inner conflicts and distorted social relationships were also involved in the origins of mental illness. So he was the one that started to put together, the social relationships of this person have been bad, might have been family or whatever. Maybe that has contributed to what's going on in their inner world. So he was starting to figure out, hey, there's something to this. Unfortunately, neither Paracelsus nor Weyer convinced enough people that their new views were valid, which is, a shame, because that could have saved some lives if people would have listened. A similar fate befell others who attempted to turn people away from demonology. An eminent English physician, Sir Reginald Scott, and even St. Vincent de Paul argued that behavioral deviance resulted from the disease process. but they too went largely unheard at the time. Later on, people are like, oh, they were ahead of their time. Well, yeah, and unfortunately, people didn't listen to them. So, unfortunately, some innocent people died. However, it was the beginning of a change. And by the 18th century, the chief ideas of these early physicians about abnormality as an illness had taken root. So, they're finally starting to see, that what's going on in people's brains might not just be, they're witch or evil or whatever. It might be there is actually a problem in the brain. One would think that would just be common sense, but clearly back in the day, there was a lot of ignorance and not a lot of common sense going on. So that's where I'm going to leave you for today. I hope that helped you figure out maybe a little bit more about why you do what you do. Please like and share this educational program, and that's what this is, an educational program. It's not designed to diagnose or treat any mental illness. If anything I talked about triggered you or you feel is a problem in your life, then by all means go and talk to your mental health professional. Like I said, like and share so we can spread it around the world. If you want to help me out, subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you want to help me out even more, go to my Patreon page and become a patron. The link to that is in my posts. So thanks for watching or listening. That's all for now. Until next time.